Chapter 8. So I think maybe we cursed Rhys. Vivi kept her voice low as she said it, glancing back over her shoulder toward the curtain in the corner of the room. He'd been back there for a while now, and she wondered what he and his dad were talking about. Could his dad do some kind of long-distance spell and find out that yes, Vivi and Gwyn had laid a curse on Rhys all those years ago? Would he declare witchy war on them? Pull the magic from Graves Glen? Would he? Vivi, if we could actually place curses on people, that bitch who always gives me whole milk when I ask for soy at Coffee Cauldron would be a dead woman by now, Gwyn said, placing another one of the chattering plastic skulls on the display table in the middle of the store. They went through thousands of the things this time of year. Parents happy to have something cheap and spooky to buy their kids. Kids delighted to chase their siblings around downtown with a cackling head. Vivi picked up a stray one from the counter now, tapping her fingernails against its teeth as she fretted. Okay, but doesn't it seem like a lot? The car thing, that might be nothing, but the statue. That thing has been there forever, Gwyn said, turning to face Vivi, her witch's hat slightly askew. And maybe when they were setting up the stage they bumped it or something. Look, if anyone should be freaked out about that statue, it's Jane. And trust me, she will be. It's gonna take like at least 2 bottles of wine to get her to chill out tonight. I didn't think you two were still a thing, Vivi said as the skull's mouth creaked open, eyes blinking, and Gwyn shrugged. We're thing adjacent. Speaking of, she added, giving Vivi a look from the corner of her eye, you and the dickbag seemed a little sparky. Setting the skull back on the counter with a thwack, Vivi straightened up. Excuse me. Another shrug as Gwyn drifted around to the other side of the table. Just saying. The chemistry seems like it's still there. And you are awfully worried about him. I'm worried that we might have accidentally hexed the son of a very powerful witch, Vivi argued, and Gwyn waved a hand. A likely story. I think you still like the dickbag. Or at least want to have sex with him, which is understandable. I actually forgot how cute he is. Or did he get cuter over the past 9 years? Moving to the counter, Gwyn faced Vivi, propping her chin in her hands. What do you think? I think that if you keep calling him the dickbag, you can't also act like you're a matchmaking tween in a Disney movie. I contain multitudes. Gwyn, I swear, Vivi started, but before she could finish that threat, the curtain opened and Rhys appeared. He looked irritated, an emotion Vivi had never associated with Rhys, and one that, disturbingly, looked really good on him. Something about the way frowning made the lines of his face even sharper, the blue of his eyes more intense. She realized she was staring, and somehow sensing that Gwyn was looking at her with more smugness than any woman should, Vivi moved from behind the counter toward Rhys, holding her hand out for the mirror that he still held. Did it work? She asked, and he blinked like he was surprised to see her there. Oh yes. Yes, got through to him no problem, thank you, he said, handing her the mirror. You said you found it at an antique store? Nodding, Vivi looked at her own reflection in the mirror, fighting the urge to stick her tongue out at her 2 pink cheeks and 2 bright eyes. Get a grip, girl. Yeah, just hanging out in the back. The owners had no idea what they had, and I decided to store it here rather than at my place. Why? Rhys was looking at her, really looking at her, and oh shit, here was another thing she'd forgotten about him. He was a champion listener. And not for show. He genuinely cared what you had to say, always wanted to know more. It was like having a spotlight on you all the time, but not in a way that made you feel exposed or on display. Just made you feel warm, appreciated, until it was gone. Vivi tore her gaze from his and looked back at the mirror. I don't know, she said. Too tempting, maybe. No one should look into the future too hard, right? Of course, she added, wiggling the mirror slightly. I didn't know it could also be used for long-distance phone calls. Only if you're trying to contact a particularly pretentious prick, Rhys said, and Vivi raised her eyebrows. So it'll work to contact you then? Rhys's smile spread across his face as slow and sweet as honey, and over his shoulder Vivi saw Gwyn smirk, her fingers coming together to produce a quick shower of purple light as she mouthed Sparky. Had Rhys not been watching her, Vivi might have had a few choice words to mouth back to her cousin. Instead, she lifted her head, holding the mirror against her chest. Anyway, everything's fine. With your father. I didn't curse you. This is just bad luck, and has nothing to do with a drunk and broken-hearted teenage witch nearly a decade ago. Rhys's smile faded, the moment lost, and Vivi told herself that was a good thing. And then, to her immense relief, he nodded. So it seems. Now just to charge the ley lines and I'm back to Wales. Write the lines. When? He pulled a delicate watch from the pocket of his vest, glancing at it. The moon rises around 7 tonight, so sometime around then? Gwyn was still watching them, although, thank the goddess, at that moment the door chimed again, meaning customers, When Gwyn learned that Vivi was going to charge the lines with Rhys, she was never going to hear the end of it. She still wanted to do it, though. As Gwyn walked toward the door, Vivi nodded at Rhys. "Meet me here at 6:30. Just a few more hours. Then she could see the ley lines, Rhys could do what he needed to do, and this could finally be over." Which was what she wanted. Absolutely. Of all the times Vivi had thought about Rhys over the years, and it had been more times than she wanted to admit, she'd never thought about something as basic and boring as having him in her car. But here he was, leaning back in the passenger seat of her Kia, the seat moved back, his long legs stretched out in front of him, her travel mug, the one with the green sparkles and frogs on it, held in one of his hands as Graves Glen disappeared behind them and they climbed higher into the hills. Twilight had just started to deepen, turning the sky a soft violet, the rest of the scenery blurring into blue, and Vivi's fingers flexed on her steering wheel as she tried very, very hard not to think of the night she'd met Rhys. It hadn't been exactly like this, of course. It had been June, not mid-October, the air softer and warmer, the colors different, but it had been another magical night, a special one, and she wondered if he was thinking about it too. He was uncharacteristically quiet over there in her passenger seat, staring out the window, occasionally taking sips of coffee. Was that part of it? Did he have to center himself or something before he did magic this big? For the first time Vivi realized that she might be in a little bit over her head here. Not with Rhys exactly, but with the magic she was about to witness. She kept her spells small, could go whole weeks without using her powers. Was she ready for what she was about to see? "It is truly amazing how much I can hear you thinking." Vivi threw him a quick glance before turning her eyes back to the road. "What, literally? Like mind reading?" Rhys chuckled and took another sip of his coffee before shaking his head. "No, I don't have that power, and even if I did, I definitely wouldn't use it on you. Only so many times a man should hear himself called a bastard, really. I just mean that you get this look when it's clear you're concentrating. It's... If you say cute, I'll throw you out of this car." "I would not dare. I was thinking more charming." Vivi couldn't help but glance over at him again. He was smiling at her, that soft, fond smile she'd completely forgotten about until this moment. And this time it was a little harder to look back at the road. "I'll allow that," she finally said. "And for your information, I wasn't really thinking about you being a bastard. I mean, that is a default thought in my brain at all times, but I wasn't actively thinking it." "Good to know. I was thinking about the ley lines. What's actually involved in charging them?" Rhys shifted in his seat, putting the coffee in her cup holder. "Less than you'd think, really. A few magic words, a little razzle-dazzle." He stretched out his hands, wiggling his fingers. "And it's done." "Oh," Vivi said, sagging a little in her seat, and he grinned, leaning back. "Were you expecting to be more impressed?" "I don't know what I was expecting," she admitted, and Rhys looked over at her, folding his arms over his chest. "You were the full Potter, right?" Vivi screwed up her face as she turned the car down the narrow lane right off the highway. The one most people would miss completely. "The what?" "The full Potter," he repeated. "Not finding out you're a witch until you're older. Not growing up with it. You're a witch, Vivi. That sort of thing." Now that she didn't have to watch for oncoming traffic, Vivi turned the full force of a glare on Rhys, knowing it was somewhat hampered by the smile she could feel tugging at the corners of her mouth. "That is not a thing people say. The full Potter." "It is too. You just don't know because you are, as stated, the full Potter." "Okay, so if you can hear me thinking again, know I'm back to the bastard thoughts." Still grinning, Rhys turned to look out the window as the car started its descent into the valley below. The night had gotten darker now, the sky more indigo than lavender, and the moon rose over the hills, bright and cold and white. The perfect night for witching. "Your mum was a witch though, yes?" Rhys asked, turning back to her, and Vivi's fingers flexed a little on the steering wheel. "She was, yeah. Apparently really good at it, but... I don't know. I guess that was her form of rebellion. Rejecting all things magic. It didn't hurt to talk about her parents anymore. The loss still ached, but the pain was a weight rather than a sharp edge. Still, it had been forever since she'd mentioned them to anyone. Love a rebellious woman, me," Rhys mused, leaning back. He was still watching her. Even though Vivi's eyes were on the road, she could feel it. "So you really didn't do any magic growing up?" he asked. "Not even accidentally?" "Oh, I totally did," Vivi replied, smiling at the memory. "Did my first spell when I was 5. I was in this treehouse my dad had built for me, and I was making tea. By which I mean I was stirring dirt and water into an old teapot I'd found in the garage. My father makes tea that clearly uses the same recipe," Rhys quipped, and Vivi laughed. "Anyway, there were these big azalea bushes under the treehouse, and I thought it would be nice to add some of the petals, but I didn't want to go all the way back down the ladder, so I thought really hard about them floating up through the window, and then they just... She lifted her hands off the wheel for just a moment, fluttering her fingers. Did. She glanced back over at Rhys, who was still watching her with that fond smile, and it made something in her chest go so tight that she had to look away, concentrating on the road in front of her again. Anyway, my mom freaked, and had this big talk with me about how that kind of thing wasn't safe, and she was right, really. I'm sure if the neighbors had seen, I would have ended up on some kind of really lurid talk show or something. Vivi hadn't thought about that moment for years, but now she could see it all over again. Her mom sitting at the edge of the bed, her hair the same color as Vivi's, but shorter, brushing against her shoulders as she leaned in, smelling like smoke and spice. I just want you to be safe, sweet girl. Floating those petals hadn't felt dangerous. It had felt fun and light, easy. But her mother's face had been so serious, and Vivi had never forgotten it, had never fully been able to detach the idea of magic from danger. She shivered now as the car descended, not from cold but just from the anticipation of what they were about to do. Or maybe she could already sense the magic in the air. I see why O.L. Griffith picked this place, Rhys murmured to himself, sitting up to peer out the windshield. You can feel it, right? She asked, and he nodded. Are we close? Just around this bend. The car came to a stop at the side of a stream, the water burbling and sighing over rocks as it flowed from the mouth of an open cave just in front of them, the entrance yawning and dark in the glow of Vivi's headlights. She shut off the car, plunging them into deeper darkness, and in the gloom Rhys turned to her, holding one hand out. Well, Vivian, he said, shall we? Chapter 10. She'd fucking cursed him. As Vivi sped back toward Graves Glen, Rhys sat in the passenger seat, staring out into the dark, still trying to wrap his mind around it. So you took a bath, he said slowly, and next to him Vivi made a frustrated sound. I told you, she said. I took a bath, lit some candles, and then Gwyn and I said a whole bunch of silly stuff about your hair and clitorises that was obviously not a real curse. Your hair looks really good, by the way, and I don't actually want to know about the rest of it, but at one point there was like this whoosh of flame and I might have said, I curse you, Rhys Penhallow, but I didn't mean it. Vivi's hands were gripped tight around the wheel, her eyes wide, and Rhys looked at her. You, literally said, I curse you, Rhys Penhallow, and now you're surprised that I, Rhys Penhallow, am cursed? Also, I'm sorry, what was that about clitorises? Vivi rolled her eyes as she turned back onto the highway. The point is, we were just being drunk and stupid. No attempt at actual magic was being made. And yet actual magic has been done, Rhys muttered, settling back into his seat. His skin still itched from the aftereffects of charging the lines, fingers tingling, and there was a strange cold sensation at the back of his neck. Was that normal, or was it part of whatever had just gone so spectacularly wrong back there? Narrowing his eyes, Rhys peered into the darkness as though he might be able to see that racing spark of magic still making its way down the mountain. All he could see, though, was the ribbon of road unfurling in front of them, and for a second, just the barest of moments, Rhys let himself believe that nothing bad had actually happened. His father had seemed so confident he hadn't been cursed after all, and when was Simon Penhallow ever wrong? Maybe this is what it was always like, charging the lines. And then Vivi's phone rang. Sang actually. The Eagle's witchy woman wailed from Vivi's purse, shoved between the front seats, and Vivi barely glanced at it, her fingers tightening on the steering wheel. Gwyn, she said, but didn't reach for her bag. It's probably nothing. No doubt, Rhys said, hoping more than he'd ever hoped for anything in his life that she was right. Wanting you to pick up pizza and cheeseburgers for dinner, he added, and Vivi looked over at him. What? He asked to her look, shrugging. America. The phone went silent, and Rhys sensed that Vivi was holding her breath. Fuck, he was holding his. And then the song started up again. Fumbling in her bag, Vivi pulled out her phone, sliding a thumb across the screen, and before she even had the phone up to her ear, Rhys could hear chaos. People shouting, someone screaming, and Gwyn yelling Vivi's name, and Rhys sank back in his seat, covering his eyes with one hand. Gwyn, calm down, Vivi was saying. I can't understand you. The phone was firmly pressed against her ear now, and Rhys watched her, actually saw the blood drain from her face as she said, We'll be there in 2 minutes. She let the phone slide from between her cheek and her shoulder, and gripped the wheel even tighter. What is it? Rhys asked, but Vivi only shook her head and said, Your seatbelt is buckled, right? Obviously, I'm not an idiot, Vivian, he said, sitting up slightly only to immediately be thrown back against his seat as Vivi pressed the gas pedal to the floor. That bad then? He asked grimly. Vivi was equally grim as she answered. Worse. Vivian had not exaggerated the speed with which they got back to Graves Glen. By Rhys's count, it was only 90-something seconds after Gwyn's phone call that they were pulling up in front of something wicked. Vivian barely put the car in park before rushing out onto the sidewalk. Rhys was a little slower, his hand resting on the top of the open car door, as he tried to take in what was happening in the front window of the shop. He spotted Gwyn easily enough standing on top of the counter, a broom raised in her hands, and there in the back corner was a trio of girls, crouched down against the wall, their faces pale, their eyes huge. And all over the floor between them and Gwyn were skulls. Small ones about the size of a baseball. Vivian was already in the shop, and he saw her pull up short with a shriek as all the skulls turned toward her almost as one, their mouths opening and closing. Rhys heard Gwyn shout something, but he was already moving into the shop, that absurd raven croaking at him as he threw the door open. Magic lay heavily over the shop, so thick it made his teeth ache, his skin humming with its power, but there was something underneath all that power. Something dark and rank, a powerful sense of wrongness hanging over the whole shop. Rhys had never felt anything like it before. The skulls skittered across the floor, their jaws opening and closing and propelling them around the hardwood at a surprising speed. The eyes were lit up too, but instead of the purple Rhys remembered from earlier, they were red now, bright red, and there were so bloody many of them. Something thumped against his ankle, and Rhys looked down to see one of the plastic skulls grinning up at him. "Steady on, mate," he muttered, wondering if he was talking to the skull or to himself. And then the skull's teeth closed around the leg of his pants. Rhys was not proud of the sound that came out of his mouth as he jerked his leg back, kicking out in an attempt at flinging the thing off. When that didn't work, he didn't even think. He pulled a thread of magic up from the soles of his feet to the tips of his fingers and blasted the damn thing to little plastic confetti. "Rhys!" He looked over to see Vivian still standing with her cousin, armed now with one of the heavy crystal balls he'd spotted earlier. She was glaring at him and then gave a significant look to the group of tourists huddled in the corner, now watching him with wide eyes, and Rhys just barely kept from scoffing as he replied, "What was I meant to do, Vivian?" There was a singed smell, the slightest hint of burning hair, and Rhys saw he'd burned a hole in his trousers, and nearly his leg with that little spell. Cursing, he patted at the smoldering hole even as he kicked another of the little plastic bastards away from him. "Fucking ridiculous," he muttered, stomping on one of the skulls, then another, before holding out his hand to Gwyn. "The broom," he called, and she tossed it to him. Catching it easily, Rhys swung the broom back down toward the floor and, in what was perhaps one of the most satisfying moments of his life, swept the skulls directly in front of him in a wide arc toward the wall. None of them broke, but they skittered drunkenly, bumping into each other, spinning around, and Rhys kept moving forward, sweeping the broom back and forth, clearing a path to the three girls in the corner. "Ladies," he said with a smile when he reached them, "hopefully we've all learned a valuable lesson about ordering things off dodgy websites." He kept grinning at them even as they stared at him. He saw one glance down at the hole in his pants, and directing them to follow him said, "Lucky thing I had a lighter on me." Given that he was currently cursed, Rhys knew using magic on them was dangerous, but charm, he'd found, was a sort of spell all its own. As he moved the girls toward the door, sweeping skulls all the while, he kept up a sort of inane chatter about checking the batteries and things before you put them out on the store floor, on the strongly worded email he was going to write to the manufacturer, and on the discount something wicked would be sure to give them the next time they came in. By the time he got them to the door, he was sick of his own voice, but the girls seemed less freaked out, one of them turning around to offer, "I once ordered an iPod off the internet, but like some random website? Not Apple. And it like totally started smoking in my pocket." "Even so," Rhys said, ushering them out onto the sidewalk. "Thank you for shopping at something wicked. Please come again." The raven over the door shrieked as Rhys closed the door with a decisive bang and reached up to pull down the little shade over the window. Once the door was firmly locked, he looked over at Gwyn and Vivian. Gwyn was still on the counter, her hands close together as a greenish light sparked back and forth between her fingers. "Nicely done, dickbag," she said, and before Rhys could object to that, which he wanted to vociferously, she nodded at Vivian. Nodding back, Vivian moved to the front window, dodging the skulls with surprising grace. "Do not notice how nice her legs look as she's stepping over possessed pieces of plastic, you absolute pervert," Rhys thought to himself, but it was no use. Vivian may have cursed him, may have been the cause of every bad thing that had happened to him since he set foot in this town, but his cock had clearly not gotten the message. Stepping to the window, Vivi lifted one hand, white light glowing there. She was using magic to close the massive velvet drapes bracketing the shop's front window. Rhys realized, and before he could call out a warning, the light jumped from her hand to the curtain. and promptly set it on fire. Vivian shrieked as one of the skulls snapped at the toe of her shoe, and Rhys crossed the store, kicking the skull even as he reached up with the broom in an attempt to bat out the flames. The smell of burned plastic filled the room as the bristles kindled, and out of the corner of his eye Rhys could make out Gwyn directing her magic toward the window. "Don't!" he shouted, and to his immense relief, he saw her drop her hands. He was slightly less relieved to realize there was now a small crowd growing outside the window, which was very much open to reveal both the utter chaos inside and all the magic they were doing to try to stop it. Wonderful. All around them the skulls were still moving, jaws opening and closing, and Rhys reached for Vivian's hand. "The storeroom!" he shouted over all that chittering, and Vivian nodded, taking his hand. Up on the counter, Gwyn looked from the window to the pair of them, then back again. "So what?" she asked. "We just hide from Night of the Living Tchotchkes and hope for the best? Do you have a better idea?" Vivian asked, but before Gwyn could reply, the door to the shop blew open, slamming hard against the wall. Rhys turned slightly to see who had managed to come in. He was sure he'd locked the damn thing, but before he could, there was a nearly deafening blast and a flash of blue light that had him throwing his free hand up against the glare. When he lowered it, he saw that there was nothing left of the skull save for a few stray pits of smoking plastic and one red blinking eye that flashed off and on a few more times before slowly dying out. In the silence that followed, Rhys was very aware of the smoky haze still lingering over the store, the scorch mark now scarring the floor in front of him and the fact that Vivian was holding his hand. He looked at their interlocked fingers, her palm almost hot against his, and then up at her face. Her cheeks were pink, eyes wide, and when she sensed him looking at her, her gaze shot to their hands. Flustered, she dropped hers, stepping away from him as her aunt moved farther into the store. "What?" Vivian's aunt said, her chest moving up and down with the force of her breathing. "Have you two done now?" Chapter 11. Maybe those toy skulls actually killed us and now we're in hell, Vivi thought as she sat in her favorite chair in the storage room, the golden velvet wingback that she'd spent so much time in. There was probably an impression of her but in the cushion. It seemed like a good explanation for why she was stuck in this night that wouldn't end. First the caves with Rhys, then that nightmare here at the store, and now, despite being nearly 30 years old, she had to explain to Aunt Elaine that she'd broken one of the most sacred rules of witchcraft because a guy hurt her feelings. And that guy was currently here. "It was an accident," she said again for what felt like the 20th time this evening. "We were just being silly." "There is no being silly with magic," Aunt Elaine said, as stern as Vivi had ever heard her. She was standing in front of one of the wardrobes, her arms folded over her chest, her hair pulled back from her face. Several earrings sparkled in her left ear, a long strand of silver dangling from the right, and she looked every inch the powerful which she actually was. "As I told both of you constantly," Elaine went on before walking over to the wardrobe and pulling out a t-shirt. "What does this say?" she asked, shaking it, and Vivi saw Gwyn roll her eyes from her own spot, sitting cross-legged on one of the trunks. "Mom," Gwyn started, and Elaine raised a hand. "Oh, you will not be mind me, young lady." Rhys, who'd been uncharacteristically quiet since they'd all retired back here, walked up to Elaine and took the t-shirt from her. "Never mix witchcraft with vodka," he read, then nodded. "Solid advice that." "Okay, no," Gwyn said, standing up from the trunk. Her mascara was smudged and there was a run in her tights, but other than that, she didn't seem that much worse for wear, given what had happened tonight. "You don't get a say in any of this. This is all your fault." "Because I did the curse?" Rhys asked, raising one eyebrow as he tossed the shirt back to Elaine. "Is that why it's my fault?" Hands on her hips, Gwyn faced off with Rhys. "Because it's your fault we had to curse you in the first place. If you hadn't shattered Vivi's heart." "I didn't shatter anything," Rhys scoffed, and Vivi's heart sped up as she watched him pause, thinking it over. Then he looked at her with those blue eyes and asked, "Vivian, did I shatter your heart?" Now not just the night that would never end, but possibly one of the worst nights of her life. "You didn't," she said, desperate to save some kind of face here. And maybe she could have had Gwyn not existed. Gaping at Vivi, Gwyn said, He very much did. Remember all the crying? The bath? You kept conjuring up the smell of his cologne, for fuck's sake." Vivi's face flamed red and she sunk farther into her chair. "I did not do that," she muttered even as Rhys stared at her in obvious shock. "You called me a fuckerneck, which is not even a word," he reminded her. "You threw my own pants at me. You weren't broken-hearted, you were angry." "Right, because no woman has ever been both those things at the same time," Gwyn said, and Vivi finally stood, scrubbing her hands over her face. "Would everyone stop acting like I was this tragic, lovelorn victim? I was a drunk teenager goofing around with my equally drunk cousin. This was not that big of a deal. She paused, then rolled her eyes. Okay, so this part of it has turned out to be a big deal, but I mean the actual cursing bit. That was not meant to be a big deal, and you're all being ridiculous about it. She pointed at Rhys. Do you really want to tell me you didn't do something overly dramatic and stupid as a teenager? Overly dramatic and stupid describes my entire teenage career, so no. Gwyn? She asked, turning to face her cousin. Screwing up her face, Gwyn said. Girl, you lived with me when I was a teenager. You know. Nodding, Vivi faced Aunt Elaine, who continued to frown at her for a beat only to finally throw up her hands and say, I know you're just going to mention the whole thing with Led Zeppelin, so let's just skip it and admit we've all done stupid things in our pasts, and leave Vivi alone about her motivation. Thank you, Vivi said. Now that we all agree that the why does not matter, the issue is the what. Namely, what this curse might mean for Graves Glen. Sighing, Elaine reached up and tugged at her earring. I assume the curse spread to the ley lines, she said. And given that the ley lines fuel all the magic in town, that magic is now corrupted. Hence evil plastic skulls. And while Vivi prided herself on being optimistic, she wasn't naive enough to think that was going to be the limit of this disaster. Who knew what other things the cursed ley lines might unleash? I need to talk to my father, Rhys said as he leaned against the wardrobe, tossing one of the skulls that had survived Elaine's spell back and forth in his hands. Every time its teeth clacked together, Vivi felt her skin crawl. Too bad they'd never be able to sell those things again because they really had been popular. But revisiting a nightmare was not worth the occasional extra $5, in Vivi's opinion. Do you want me to get the mirror? She asked Rhys, and he raised his head, startled. I said I need to talk to him, not that I'm actually going to do it. Rhys shuddered. This night has been horrible enough already. Simon will need to be told, Aunt Elaine said on a sigh, sinking into the chair Vivi had just vacated. And I don't look forward to his reaction. What can he do? Gwyn asked. I mean, other than be a dick about it. Pushing off the wardrobe, Rhys gave a humorless laugh. Ah, the times I've asked myself, what can my father do about something other than be a dick? Only to find out he can do plenty. Vivi had already been worried. Battling a bunch of toys come to life had that effect on a girl, but now she felt her heart plunge somewhere south of her knees. Rhys's father. Is your dad going to come here? She asked Rhys. And smite us? The corner of Rhys's mouth lifted just the littlest bit. Honestly, with most people, I'd make fun of the word smite here, but in my father's case. The smile faded and Vivi's hopes went with it. She thought of the tarot card Gwyn had drawn, Aunt Elaine's cabin as the tower, cracked in two and sliding off the side of the mountain. What if that had been some kind of prophecy? You're turning green, Gwyn said, crossing the room to stand in front of Vivi. We're gonna fix this, she said, laying her hands on Vivi's shoulders and giving a shake. We're badass witches, remember? You're a badass witch, Vivi reminded her. Aunt Elaine is a badass witch. I'm a history teacher. You can be both. Gwyn's hands tightened. And this isn't your fault. It was my idea to curse him, remember? But it was my magic that did it, Vivi replied, remembering that candle flame. How the words coming out of her mouth had felt different. Heavier. Charged somehow. The one truly powerful spell she'd ever managed, and it was going to wreck everything for her. Classic. If I, as the cursed party, might interject here, Rhys said, shoving his hands in his pockets. Isn't it possible we might all be overreacting a little? Yes, tonight was shit, no getting around that. Yes, we're all a bit freaked out and understandably so, but so far these little buggers, he nodded at the skull he tossed to the chair, are the only thing we've dealt with. That and my simple hey, close the drape spell ending in fire, Vivi reminded him, and he shrugged. You said yourself your magic has always been a bit. What was the word? Wonky. Well, mine is very much unwonky, Aunt Elaine said, hands on her hips. And that spell I used to clear the store was far more powerful than I intended. Rhys nodded. All valid points. But maybe not enough evidence to say things have gone completely tits up yet. Begging your pardon, Miss Jones. I have tits, so I think I can handle hearing the word spoken, Mr. Penhallow, Aunt Elaine said with a dismissive wave before sighing and steepling her fingers against her mouth. Never a good sign. The last time Vivi had seen that gesture from Aunt Elaine had been the time Gwyn had briefly gotten engaged to the guy who read fortunes at the Run Fair and called himself Lord Falcon despite his driver's license saying Tim Davis. But now Aunt Elaine only took another deep breath and said, I think you may be right. Maybe this isn't as bad as it seems. It seems pretty bad, Mom, Gwyn said, frowning, speaking as someone nearly eaten by plastic. No, Rhys has a point, Vivi said, surprising herself. And Rhys too, if his raised eyebrows were anything to go by. We don't know how bad this is. or if it was just some weird little spike. And whatever it is, we're not going to fix it tonight. The more she talked, the better she felt. Of course, what they needed was a plan. Vivi was really good at plans. Look, we'll all go home, get some sleep, and in the morning we'll see what things look like. Rhys, you'll talk to your father. He scowled but didn't disagree, so Vivi went on, pointing at Elaine. And you'll see what you can find about removing curses, and you, she turned to Gwyn, will just keep running the store and assuring people that tonight's little show was all part of the Founders' Day fun. I like how my job is the only one with any real threat of danger, Gwyn said, but off Vivi's look, she lifted her hands in defeat. Okay. Operation Soothe the Muggles, I'm on it. Good, Vivi said. So that's it. We have a plan. A kind of half-ass one, but a plan nonetheless. Quarter-ass if you ask me, Rhys muttered but then nodded at her. But certainly better than nothing. Glancing around him, he sighed. And at least I'll get to reacquaint myself with Graves Glen after all this time. When Vivi only stared at him, he added, I mean, it's not as if I can go home until all this is over. He was right. She knew that. Of course, getting this sorted out meant that Rhys would stay here. In her town. Working with her. He smiled at her then, winking, and despite all of it, the curse, the embarrassment, the freaking tiny plastic skulls of death, Vivi's heart did a neat little flip in her chest. Yep, definitely in hell. Chapter 12. Vivi woke up to find Sir Percival staring at her. That wasn't all that unusual. He'd always liked to find whoever the last person in bed was in the mornings and snuggle in, and since Gwyn and Aunt Elaine were both early risers, that had almost always been Vivi back when she'd lived here. What was unusual was that he blinked his yellow-green eyes at her, yawned and then said, treats. Now it was Vivi's turn to blink. Dreaming, she muttered to herself. Last night had been awfully traumatic after all. Made sense she'd have a really vivid, really bizarre dream that felt real but wasn't. Treats, Sir Percival said again, butting his head against Vivi's arm. And okay, no, this was real. They had a talking cat. Gwyn, Vivi called, scooting back a little bit in her bed, and Sir Percival continued to pace and turn in circles, a constant refrain of treats, spilling from his whiskered lips. Vivi heard footsteps on the stairs, and then Gwyn was there, still in her pajamas, her hair pushed back from her face with a brightly colored headband. What is it? Gwyn asked, and Vivi nodded at Sir Percival. He talks now. Gwyn blinked at her, then looked back to Sir Percival before giving a shriek of delight and clapping her hands. He does. Rushing into the room, she scooped up her cat, holding him in front of her face. What did he say? She asked. Because I've always wanted a talking cat. And I think if any cat is going to be a stimulating conversationalist, it's Treats, Sir Percival croaked again, and then began wiggling in Gwyn's arms. Treats, food treats. He mostly says that, Vivi said, pushing back the covers, and Gwyn frowned at her cat. Okay, but maybe once he gets treats he'll have more to say. With that, she set him back on the bed and rushed out of the room, returning a few seconds later with the bag of cat treats. Shaking out a few in her hand, she offered them to Sir Percival, who gobbled them up. Now say thank you, buddy, Gwyn coached. Percival licked his chops and headbutt her hand. Treats, he began again. I think maybe that's all he can say? Vivi offered. Treats. I changed my mind, Gwyn said, scrambling to give Percival more treats. Talking cats are bad. I see that now. Then she looked up at Vivi, who was getting out of bed. This is because of what Rhys did to the ley lines, isn't it? Like the skulls last night. It's because of what I did to Rhys, Vivi corrected on a sigh, her eyes falling on the duffel bag she'd hastily packed at her place last night. She couldn't quite say why she decided to spend the night at Elaine's, just that the idea of going to sleep in her apartment above the store had definitely not appealed. Now, as Gwyn muttered to Percival, Vivi took out the skirt and blouse she delicately folded into her bag last night. Which means that we were right. There's a lot more bad shit to come. Gwyn shot her a look as she tucked Percival underneath her chin. This is not bad shit, she argued then when Percival continued to ask for treats, shrugged. Okay, it's not the best shit, but I still don't think it's evidence of a horrible curse. She gave Vivi another smile before carrying Percival to the door. I told you, Vivi. We're gonna fix this. Vivi wished she felt that confident. She also wished she didn't feel so damn embarrassed about the whole thing. Because that's what had kept her awake last night, staring at the ceiling until well past 2 in the morning. There was guilt and fear and worry, of course, all that was mixed up in there, but overriding all of it was Rhys knows he broke my heart. Not only that, Rhys knew he'd broken it so badly that she'd done magic over it. And clearly he hadn't felt the same way back then, since it had never even occurred to him that she'd actually been that sad over it. Which proved, as she'd always suspected, their fling had meant a lot more to her than it had to him. He'd probably barely thought of her over the past 9 years, had certainly never Googled her while kind of wine-drunk, and while there was no doubt they were still attracted to each other, Vivi was older now. Wiser. And the last thing she was going to do was fall for Rhys Penhallow all over again. 15 minutes later, she was heading downstairs, her still damp hair twisted up in a bun, her jacket hanging off her shoulders, and she was so focused on getting out the door that it took her a second to realize she heard voices in the kitchen. And not just any voices. Turning the corner, she looked at her aunt's cozy kitchen table, the table around which she'd made candles and plucked flower petals for bath salts and never, ever eaten breakfast, and there was Rhys, coffee mug at his elbow, sticky bun in hand, smiling at her aunt, who was smiling back almost affectionately, indulgently. And then Vivi realized the kitchen didn't smell like its usual mix of herbs and smoke, but of sugar and cinnamon. "Aunt Elaine," she asked, firmly ignoring Rhys, "did you bake?" Her aunt's cheeks actually turned a little pink. "You don't have to sound so scandalized, Vivi," she said, waving one hand as she got up from the table and crossed the kitchen to the coffee pot. "I can cook, you know. I've just usually chosen not to." "Which is a crime and a sin," Rhys said, licking a stray bit of icing off his thumb, a gesture that made Vivi's own face suddenly feel a little pink. How did he look so good after the night they'd all had? Vivi felt like the circles under her eyes deserved their own zip code, and when she glanced down, she noticed that her blouse was misbuttoned. And there he sat, wearing dark jeans and a charcoal sweater, his hair still very much doing the thing despite the curse that was evidently real, and for just a second Vivi gave some serious thought to cursing him again. Instead, she also made her way to the coffee pot, grabbing a mug from the shelf above it. It was one of the ones they sold in the shop, white with a purple silhouette of a witch zooming away on a broomstick, the words "Life's a witch, then you fly," in curling script below the rim. "What are you doing here, Rhys?" she asked once she was a little more caffeinated. She wanted to resist the sticky buns on principle, but they smelled too good to pass up, so Vivi grabbed one still warm from the pan, careful not to let it drip on her skirt as she sat at the table. Leaning back, Rhys folded his hands on his stomach and studied her. "Well, Vivian, I don't know if you remember, but it turns out I was horribly cursed, so." Rolling her eyes, Vivi held up the hand still holding the sticky bun. "Yes, I know, we can skip the sarcasm. I mean, why are you in my aunt's kitchen right now?" "We're looking into curses," Aunt Elaine said, rejoining them at the table. She nodded toward a yellow legal pad and a large open book Vivi had somehow missed, and now Vivi licked her own fingers before reaching over for it. The book was heavy, the binding ancient and cracked, and Vivi could barely make out the letters stamped in gold foil on its spine. And even once she could, they didn't spell any words she recognized. "I guess it's too much to hope that there was a really clear and easy-to-do anti-curse ritual in this, huh?" Vivi asked, carefully turning the pages. The paper was so thick that it crackled slightly, the illustrations painted and lurid. Vivi paused on one that showed a man hanging from a tree branch by his ankles, all his insides on the outside. "Ew," she muttered, and suddenly Rhys was there, leaning over her shoulder to look. "Ah yes, the trial of Ghent," he said. "We had an ancestor that attempted that. Didn't end well. You basically take your own entrails out and then—" "Do not want to know," Vivi said, quickly turning the page and also trying to ignore how good Rhys smelled. "You're not allowed to feel turned on when the word entrails was just bandied about," she told herself. "So far we haven't had much luck," Elaine said. "But one bright spot. Thanks to Rhys using his magic to fuel the ley lines, most of the curse has probably drained off of him." She tapped the cover of another book. The Law of Transmutation. Rhys was cursed, but in funneling his magic into another power source. "I passed on some of the curse to the ley lines instead," Rhys finished. "So still cursed but diluted. Maybe. Half of that particular page was ripped out, so we're really just spitballing here." "Great," Vivi replied weakly. And it was great that maybe Rhys could walk through town without being a disaster magnet, but she still felt guilt sitting like a rock in her stomach. "One question," Gwyn said, coming into the kitchen. She was still in her pajamas, her long red hair in a braid over one shoulder. "Only one?" Vivi asked, eyebrows raised. "Okay, lots, but one for right now." She pointed at Rhys. "His hair. Still doing the thing. And it's been doing the thing ever since he got into town." Rhys frowned, reaching up to tug at his hair. "What thing?" "Oh, like you don't know," Gwyn said, and Rhys's frown deepened. "Seriously, what?" Aunt Elaine stopped them both with a lifted hand. "I take it the two of you specified something about Rhys's hair during the curse?" Now Rhys's hand dropped from his head and he stared at Gwyn and Vivi. You tried to attack my hair? Curse magic doesn't work like that, Aunt Elaine went on, ignoring him. You'll get general bad luck or if you go really dark death. But nothing that small or specific. God, Gwyn sighed. Now we don't have to feel guilty about the clitoris thing anymore. Treats. Oh, thank the goddess. Vivi looked up to where Sir Percival had just strolled into the kitchen, twining himself around Elaine's ankles as she stared at him. Oh right, Vivi said, shutting the book. He talks now, but he mostly just says that. Elaine and Rhys both took that in before Rhys nodded and said, right, of course he does. Reaching down to pet the cat, Elaine looked over at Vivi. Why are you all dressed up? She asked, and Vivi looked down her body, frowning too. I'm not, she said. I'm just going to work. At the college? Aunt Elaine's eyebrows disappeared beneath her shaggy bangs. Today. Yes, today, Vivi said, standing up and straightening her jacket. Why wouldn't I? We have important things to do today. Aunt Elaine placed one hand on her hip, the other holding a wooden spoon. Which business? And I have a 9 a.m. class, Vivi countered. Which I can't just cancel. We talked about this last night. We talked about Gwyn reopening the store as though everything were normal, Elaine countered. Not about you going to teach class. This, she tapped the book in front of her, is more important right now. I can do both, Vivi said, standing up. Penhaven is also a witchy college, remember? I can teach class, then go to the library, see if there are any more useful books there. She only barely managed to keep from frowning as she said it. Vivi had worked hard to keep her work life and her witch life separate, which meant she very rarely dealt with anything involving Penhaven's more secretive classes. But when you had a witchy problem, it seemed stupid not to use that resource. Even if that resource tended to smell like patchouli. Rhys was already grabbing his own jacket from the back of his chair. I'll come with. Vivi stared. To the college? He gave a shrug. Why not? I am an alum after all. You came for one summer course which I don't think you actually attended more than, what? 5 classes of. Rhys winked at her. And whose fault was that? Okay, they were heading into dangerous territory now, and Vivi turned away to pull her keys out of her purse, breaking eye contact before she did something embarrassing like blush. Again. Besides, Rhys said, it's clearly not safe for me to be out on my own now, all cursed and what have you, so might as well stick close to the one that did the cursing. I am never living this down, am I? It's certainly going to be the subject of conversation for a while, yes. Vivi looked up at him then, scowling, and was about to remind him that there wouldn't even be a curse had he not been such an asshole 9 years ago. But before she could, she noticed the shadows underneath his own eyes, the tension in his smile even as he attempted to give her his usual rakish grin. As horrible as it sounded, that was actually kind of comforting, knowing that Rhys was freaked out about this. All this quippiness and pastry eating were just a cover. Had he always done that? She couldn't remember. Of course, she'd only known him for a few months nearly a decade ago. Weird to think that someone who had loomed so large over her romantic life for so long was basically a stranger. Shaking off that thought, Vivi stepped back from him. Fine. Come with. I'll go teach, and you can go check out the special collections at the college library. Is that a euphemism? Rhys asked. I really hope it's a euphemism. Nope, Vivi replied, already pulling out her phone to send an email to the director of Penhaven's library. It's exactly what it sounds like. Chapter 13. Penhaven College was smaller than Rhys remembered. And as he and Vivi made their way across campus, it dawned on him that it was very strange a place named after his gloomy and depressing home could be this light, this cheerful, all red brick buildings with white trim, bright lawns and autumn leaves in bold colors everywhere he looked. Nice place to work, he commented to Vivian, who was about 2 steps ahead of him, her low heels clicking on the brick walkway. It is, she replied, but she was obviously distracted, looking around with these quick, darting glances, and Rhys jogged a little to catch up with her. What is it? He asked in a low voice. Something amiss? She shook her head. No, nothing I can see right now, but you're keeping an eye out. Exactly. Rhys looked around too, although he wasn't sure what he was looking for. There were no statues to fall on him, no cars to suddenly come careening his way. But who was to say a sudden sinkhole wouldn't open up in the ground or that a stray tree limb might not come winging down from the heavens? The sooner they got this fixed, the better. Besides, once he wasn't cursed anymore, maybe he would stop feeling like such an utter bastard. He knew Vivian had been angry with him, furious even, and he'd deserved every bit of it. But that he'd hurt her badly enough that she'd done this. Fuck, that bothered him. There was a set of concrete steps just ahead of them, leading down to a white building at the base of the small hill, and Vivian stopped just on the top step, turning back to look at him. Be careful. With 5 steps. She scowled, one hand on her hip. Do I need to remind you of what's going on? You don't, he assured her. But you heard what Elaine said. The curse is almost certainly doing its thing on the town now, not me, and besides, do you really think these steps are going to take me out? Do you want to hold my hand as I walk down them? Vivian muttered something under her breath, then turned and walked down the steps, leaving Rhys to follow. Carefully. Rhys didn't know what he'd expected Vivian's office to look like, but as he followed her down the hall of the bright and airy building that housed the history department, it occurred to him that he hadn't exactly given a huge amount of thought to anything when it came to adult Vivian. It was almost like she was frozen in his memory at 19, but now here she was, a grown woman with an office and a career, and he suddenly desperately wanted to know everything about her. Why history? He asked as they stopped in front of a white door with a frosted window, V. Jones stenciled in neat black letters on the glass. And why regular history at that? She gave him a look as she unlocked the office door. Why not witchy history, you mean? Shrugging, Rhys leaned against the wall. It seems like a fair question. Vivian paused, her key still in the lock, and for a moment, Rhys thought she might not answer him at all. And then she finally sighed and said, Believe it or not, I actually like regular history, and also, I don't know. I guess it's just that I spent most of my life being more or less a regular person, so that's where I'm more comfortable. With that, she pushed open the door and after a beat, Rhys followed her inside. The office was tiny, barely enough room for a desk, 2 chairs and a slightly crooked bookshelf, but it was homey and cozy, reminding him a little of the space at the back of Something Wicked. There were plants and colorful posters of medieval tapestries, an electric kettle with big flowers painted on it, and on her desk, he spotted pictures of her with Gwyn and Elaine, plus a couple of shots with people he didn't recognize. He would have liked to have said he didn't check for any guys, but that would have been the most blatant of lies. He was absolutely checking to see if there was some picture of Vivi in her polka dots, some absolute bastard's arm around her waist. But no, nothing like that. So what sort of history do you teach? He asked, turning his attention to the bookshelf. Christ, it even smelled like her in here, that warm soft scent that either he hadn't remembered or was new. Another part of this new Vivian he wanted to learn about. The basics, she replied, distracted as she dug through her desk for something. Intro to Western civilization. Ah, so you're stuck with the first years. We say freshmen here, and yes, although I actually like teaching them. She looked up, smiling a little. It's nice, getting to introduce kids to something you really love. He could see it then, what she must be like when she taught. The way her cheeks would flush when she got on a topic she was passionate about, the light in her eyes. Her kids must love her. I get that, he said, nodding. It's like when I arrange a trip for people to a place they've never been before. I love seeing their faces when they get back. Love looking at the 5 million pictures they took on their phones. Okay, well, I don't actually love that, but it's still kind of fun. Her smile widened a little. I bet. For just a moment they could have been 2 strangers, Rhys thought. Just 2 people chatting about their jobs, maybe lightly sussing each other out. And then once again he had the unsettling feeling that that's what they were in a way. Except that she could never be a stranger, never just be some woman he fancied, and he needed to stop being distracted by her pretty eyes and lovely hair, and remember that he was cursed now. Clearing his throat, he turned back to the shelves. Right. Curse. Problem to be solved. Focus on that. You have a lot of books about whales over here. Bloody hell, mate. When he glanced back over at her, he saw that Vivian was no longer looking at him, had become very interested in something on her desk. Yes, well, that was my focus. In grad school. Llewellyn the Great, Edward I, all of that. She met his eyes. Because of the town history. Obviously. Nothing to do with you. Wouldn't dare to think it. He turned back to the shelves, thumbing through a book on the castles of the Marches when Vivian suddenly asked, Do you not like it there? Rhys put the book back, turning around. Where in Wales? She nodded, and he sighed, folding his arms over his chest as he leaned back against her bookshelf. St. Bugey's balls, how could he explain to Vivian the way he felt about his home? I love it, he said at last. The most beautiful place in the world, truly. Mountains, the sea, poetry, rugby. The national animal is a dragon, for fuck's sake. What's not to love? But you created a job for yourself where you're always traveling, she said, straightening up. And back. Back when we were, She tucked her hair behind one ear, cheeks coloring prettily. When we were involved, you said you never liked to visit your hometown. Well, yes, but that's because of my father, not because of the town itself, he replied with what he hoped was a rakish grin. This conversation was beginning to skirt too close to things Rhys worked very hard not to think about, so a little rakishness was needed. And it clearly did the trick because Vivian narrowed her eyes, but didn't press further, and after a moment, she lifted something out from underneath a pile of papers. Okay, found my library card, so let's get you over there. It's on the way to my first class. Another trip across campus, this one shorter since the library was just up the hill from the history building, but this time Rhys sensed something different. This part of campus looked the same as everything else, the brick, the ivy, all of that, but he could feel it in the air. Magic. Before he even asked, Vivian nodded. The other part of the college is here. In those buildings. She nodded at a cluster of 4 smaller classroom buildings, all grouped together underneath a copse of massive oak trees, shaded even on this bright sunny day. When I was here they were just mixed in the regular classrooms, Rhys said, and Vivian rolled her eyes. Right. Well, that only worked until the first time a regular student bumbled past the wards and into a class on augury, and tried to take a video of it with his cell phone. A couple of years ago, all magic classes were relocated to those buildings. Makes sense. And the bumbling students? Rhys asked as he watched a couple of girls in jeans and sweaters jog up the steps of one of the magic buildings. Kept out by the same kind of repulsion spell that protects the back room of the store, Vivian answered. Easier to maintain and make stronger when it's over one central location, not a bunch of separate classrooms. Plus this arrangement keeps them out of everyone's hair. They were at the library now, a building Rhys had decidedly never visited in all his time at Penhaven, and it was appropriately Gothic-looking with huge white columns and pointed windows. Still, Rhys paused outside, jerking his head back toward the magical part of the college. You never hang out with them? Even though they're witches too? Vivian followed his gaze and shook her head. No, there. Look, you can meet them if you want. You'll see. Vivian Jones, you snob. She snorted at that, and then gestured for him to follow her. Come on. We might not be talking to them, but we're definitely using some of their resources. Chapter 14. Vivi had never liked Penhaven's library. Maybe it was too close to the witchy side of things, or maybe it was the fact that, unlike the rest of campus, it was dark and slightly foreboding, almost medieval with its narrow windows and dark stone, the towering shelves blocking out what little light did manage to make it in. Even with the banks of computers in the center of the first floor, Vivi still felt she was stepping into the 12th century or something every time she came in here. And as she led Rhys toward the back, she actually shivered a little, pulling her jacket tighter around her. Bloody hell, Rhys muttered next to her. Do they hang meat in here? It's not usually this cold, she replied, frowning. Seriously, the library was not always her favorite place, but it usually wasn't quite this chilly and oppressive. And when she glanced around, she noticed that the few students in there at this time of the morning were clearly feeling it, too, huddled at the study carrels, their shoulders up around their ears. Heating must be out, she said before looking over at Rhys. Good thing you brought a jacket. Also good thing I'm from a country for whom chilly and dank could be written on the flag or possibly in some sort of motto, Rhys said. Viv opened her mouth, wanting to ask him more about Wales, but she shut it just as quickly, shaking her head as she continued to head for the special collections. Bad enough Rhys had found out that she'd studied Welsh history in college and grad school. She didn't need to make any more small talk with him that inadvertently revealed too much. Not that she'd studied Wales because of Rhys, she definitely had not. Not even a little. Yes, him talking about it that summer had piqued her interest, but you didn't devote years of your life to study because a guy you went out with for 3 months talked about it one time. Just like her never actually going to Wales had nothing to do with him either. It was a small country, but she could have avoided him because what were the chances? Vivian, Rhys whispered, leaning down so close that his breath wafted warm over her ear, and now her goosebumps were from more than the cold. We're in a library. She stopped, confused, and then Rhys put a finger over his lips. You're thinking too loud. Vivi wasn't sure if she wanted to laugh or flip him off, so she settled for ignoring him. And if she smiled a little when her back was to him, that was her business. There was something wrong with this library. Rhys hadn't been in all that many libraries over the course of his life, but he'd been in enough to know they usually didn't feel like this. Hell, even his family home, the scariest place on God's green earth, as far as Rhys was concerned, didn't feel like this. It wasn't just the chill in the air, although as he and Vivian walked through a pair of heavy wooden doors to access the back of the library, he was very glad he'd thrown on his leather jacket this morning. It was something unnatural, something off, and the feeling crawled over his skin in a way he didn't like. Vivian felt it too. He could tell from the way her gaze kept darting around, But she wasn't saying anything, so he wasn't going to mention it either, even though he knew they were both wondering the same thing. Was this something to do with the curse and the ley lines? They passed through long rows of shelves, the space between them getting narrower and narrower until they had to walk single file, Vivian leading the way. She'd worn her hair up today in a messy knot caught at the back of her neck, and in spite of everything, Rhys's fingers itched to reach out and take it down. What would she do if he did? Kick you in the balls as you'd so rightly deserve, he reminded himself, and shoving those feelings down, continued to follow Vivi through the warren of shelves. Finally, the shelves opened up, and they stood in a dim circular room, a massive oak desk in the center of it, raised so high that Rhys's chin barely came up to the edge. Vivian, tall as she was, had to stand on tiptoes to peer over. "Dr. Foulke?" she called softly, and an ancient, wizened face suddenly appeared. "Miss Jones." Smiling with relief, Vivian rocked back on her heels and adjusted her bag on her shoulder. "Yes, this is my research assistant." She jerked a thumb at Rhys, and he looked up at the ancient woman behind the desk, wondering if this would actually work. If she was a witch and worked at Penhaven, there was a good chance she might know who he was. But the woman at the desk didn't seem to care much. She barely gave Rhys a cursory glance before nodding and typing something out on a computer in front of her. 2 hours, she said, and there was a little whir as a machine printed out a sticker, which she handed to Vivian, who turned and handed it to Rhys. Jones guessed it read a little timestamp underneath, and Rhys frowned. "This is a lot more prosaic than I was expecting." "We live in the 21st century, Dr. Foulke said from her perch, folding her arms over her narrow chest. "Forgive us for not scratching your name on vellum with a quill." "Well, I don't need vellum, but the odd quill would be." "Thank you, Dr. Foulke," Vivian said quickly, pulling Rhys away. "Your research assistant?" he asked as they moved deeper into the stacks. "It was the first thing I could think of," she whispered back. "And, I mean, it's not completely untrue." She stopped as they reached the back of the room, nodding at a row of doors. "Take anything you find into one of those rooms, and I'll meet you back here in an hour or so, as soon as I get out of class. You can ask Dr. Foulke or any of the other librarians if you need help, but don't." "Vivian." He stopped her by stepping closer, reaching out to put his hands on her shoulders before he thought better of it and stepped back again. "I am a grown adult man," he said instead. "I think I can manage asking for help without giving away the whole plot." Her pursed lips told him she might not actually believe that, but she gave a nod anyway. "Good. I'll help once I'm back." With that, she was turning away in a swirl of golden hair and black skirt, leaving Rhys alone in her deeply creepy library. Not just creepy but heavy. Ancient magic, the truly old deep stuff, hummed through the room like a current of electricity, the kind of magic that made you feel a little uncomfortable, skin suddenly too sensitive, teeth aching slightly. Grimacing, Rhys rolled his shoulders and stepped farther into the breach. 15 minutes later, and with no assistance at all, "Thank you very much, Vivian Jones," Rhys had a stack of books and made his way to one of the doors in the back. The study room was tiny, nearly claustrophobic with no windows, the only light from a heavy glass lamp overhead, and nothing more than a large wooden table in the middle, an ancient slab of oak that also seemed to hold some magical properties. When Rhys put his hand flat on the top, he could feel a slight vibration. Sighing, he opened the first book from the stack. It was mostly in Latin, and Rhys felt that part of his brain creak slowly into life as he read. Hadn't had much use for Latin since school, and had taken something of a perverse pleasure in not being as fluent in it as his father and brothers, insisting any magic that required this much work wasn't worth it. He maybe regretted that now. Just a smidgen. And as he read, he couldn't stop thinking about his father, whom he definitely should be calling. Right now, this minute, actually several hours ago. Simon would know what to do. He always did. But that didn't mean Rhys was ready to talk to him about this yet. Was that because he was afraid of his father's reaction when he learned he'd actually been wrong about something? Or was it because of Vivian? Rhys groaned and closed the book in front of him, reaching up to rub his eyes with one hand. What a fucking mess this all was. How could he explain to Simon that this wasn't some act of war on Vivian's part, but just a teenage girl who'd been hurt by him being a complete dickhead, and a spell that had gotten out of hand? Simon wouldn't understand that. Simon had not, to Rhys's knowledge, ever even been a teenager, probably. Seemed likely he just sprung fully formed and terrifying out of a cloud or something. And then Rhys realized who he could call. Simon was out, but there was the younger, slightly less terrifying version of Simon. Pulling out his phone, Rhys quickly did the math on what time it was back home, and dialed. Within about 5 minutes, he was deeply regretting that decision. "You have to come home." "Come home? All cursed and such?" Wells, I know I'm not your favorite person in the world, but wishing me dead seems a bit much. I don't wish you dead, you git, but it's obvious that you can't stay there with a coven of witches who cursed you. Sighing, Rhys closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose between thumb and forefinger. This was what he'd been worried about. You're making it sound worse than it is. It wasn't like that, it was. I don't care what it was like, Wells said, and Rhys could almost see him there behind the bar at the pub, glowering at his mobile. You need to come home, and you need to talk to Father about this. Or, Rhys suggested, secondary, also solid plan. I do neither of those things, and you help me think of some way to break this curse without having to involve Da. On the other end of the line, Llewellyn blew out a breath that Rhys could practically feel. I can ask around. Discreetly. Wells made a rude noise. The day I need directions from you on how to be discreet is the day I fling myself off the top of Mount Snowdon. Something to look forward to then, Rhys replied cheerful, and there was a pause on the other end of the line before Wells said, Seriously, mate, be careful. It would. If something were to ever happen to you. I know we. Sitting up straighter, Rhys looked in horror at his phone. Oh my God, Wells, please stop. Too right, Wells agreed, clearing his throat. Anyway, try not to die. As your older brother, I get the first shot at taking you down, Bowen the second, so it would be very unfair if you perished there in the wilds of America without letting us have our chance. Relieved to be back to taking the piss and not actually sharing feelings, Rhys nodded and tapped his pen on the desk. Fair enough, old man. He ended the call and slid his phone back into his pocket, wishing he felt better about this whole thing. Having Wells on his side was definitely a boon, but it wasn't going to be enough. Rhys needed to figure out how to break this curse as fast as possible, and so far the books weren't exactly helping. Oh, there was information on curses, but mostly how to lay one. Apparently no witch ever wanted to break a curse. Typical. By the time Vivian slid into the research room an hour or so later, Rhys's eyes ached from trying to parse out tiny script. His brain hurt from all the translating and his hand was cramped from writing down every little bit of information that might be useful. And he still didn't feel like he had learned any more than he'd already known when he'd come in here. I don't suppose you brought coffee? He asked Vivian, not looking up. He'd just come across an anecdote about a Scottish farmer who suspected his crops were cursed, and had attempted to reverse the spell. Going by the illustration, it seemed to have ended with him turning into a rather large cat, but it was still better than nothing. If I tried to bring coffee into this part of the library, Dr. Fulk would hang me up by my toenails, so no, Vivian replied, coming to perch on the edge of the table. As she did, Rhys caught that scent again, that sweet, almost sugary smell that clung to her skin, and his fingers tightened around his pen. How goes it? She asked, leaning in to see what he was writing, and Rhys sat back in his chair, rolling his shoulders to alleviate some of the tension that had gathered there. Not well, he admitted. But to be fair, I've only been at it for a little while. And of course, since I can't alert the other witches here as to what I'm doing, I'm stumbling in the dark a little bit. Vivian frowned, a wrinkle appearing over her nose, and Rhys wanted to reach out and smooth it away with his thumb. Then she stood up. Well, I'm here now and I can help. What books haven't you looked at yet? 30 minutes later she sighed and closed the last book, its spine creaking ominously. So this one is useless. Leaning across the table, she reached for another from the stack, but even as her fingers closed over the cover, Rhys shook his head. Already tried that one. What about this one? She asked, tapping her fingers on another book, and Rhys barely looked up before shaking his head again. Also a dud. Vivian sat up straighter in her chair. Okay, so this entire endeavor has been a bust then? Rhys finally looked up at her. Did you think this was going to be easy? Rising from her seat, Vivian rubbed the back of her neck. No, but it shouldn't be this hard to reverse a curse. Especially a curse this stupid. Throwing up her hands, she added. I mean, we were barely even a thing. Rhys was tired. He was cranky. And he was quite literally cursed, which is probably why those words. Irked. More than irked, really. Infuriated. Enough of a thing that you cursed me when I left. Vivian frowned, her hand resting again on the back of her neck. You didn't leave, she reminded him. I left you after you suddenly remembered you were engaged. Tilting his head back to look at the ceiling, Rhys groaned. I was not engaged, I was betrothed, which is not. I know, she said, standing up. Not the same thing. So you tried to say at the time, but I gotta say, Rhys, I was not in the mood for a discussion about semantics then, and I definitely am not now. Had he forgotten that she could be this frustrating, or was this a new trait, another facet of adult Vivian he hadn't learned? Rising from his chair, Rhys stepped closer to her, suddenly aware of just how small the study room was, how close they were. Christ, he should go home. To Wales. He should say bugger it to all this and leave. Instead he said, that summer was important, Vivian. It meant something. Her lips were parted, her breath coming fast, and every cell in Rhys's body wanted to touch her even as his mind was screaming for him to back off. Then Vivian's eyes narrowed, and she stepped closer to him. It was a 3-month fling that I barely remember. Bollocks, he countered. Extremely not bollocks. She was openly glaring at him now. Her hands curled into fists at her sides as he moved in closer. So you don't remember the first time we kissed? Rhys did. He'd remember it until he died. They'd been sitting on top of a hill, the night a soft violet all around them, the smell of bonfires in summer in the air, and when he'd asked if he could kiss her, he'd nearly been holding his breath, wanting her to say yes more than he'd ever wanted anything in his life. I've kissed a lot of guys, Vivian said, shrugging. They all blend together after a while. Do they indeed? Rhys said, and somehow he and Vivian were very close now, close enough for him to see how wide her pupils were, the flush climbing up her neck. Yup, she replied, and he saw her gaze flick to his mouth. Guess you should have been more memorable. And if I were to kiss you now, Rhys said, his voice gone low as he looked down at her, would that refresh your memory? She was going to tell him to fuck off. Or slap him. Possibly knee him in the balls. Those were all things he was ready for. What Rhys had not expected was for her to step so close that their bodies aligned, chest to chest, hips to hips. Go for it. Chapter 15. The moment his lips met hers, Vivi realized she'd made a terrible mistake. It had probably been too much to hope that the intervening years had somehow made Rhys worse at kissing, even with the curse. And of course she'd lied to him when she said she couldn't remember his kiss. She'd remembered everything when it came to him. Every kiss, every touch. Those months with Rhys Penhallow had been prime fantasy material over the years, her own personal X-rated scrapbook. But maybe she hadn't been lying after all, because as he kissed her, she realized she hadn't remembered exactly how good it was. How good he was at this. He kissed her like he'd been dying to kiss her every one of these past 9 years, a low growl rumbling in his chest when his tongue met hers, and Vivi felt that sound all the way down to her toes. Hands cupping her face, Rhys tilted her head, deepening the kiss, and Vivi's own fingers clutched at his shoulders, needing to get as close to him as she could. As he backed up, pulling her with him, his hip nudged the table. Vivi heard that one precarious stack of books hit the floor almost from a distance as she turned around, propping herself up on the edge of the table, never taking her hands off him, her eyes closed, her blood so hot in her veins she was surprised her skin wasn't steaming. Christ, I forgot. He was muttering against her neck, his mouth hot. How did I forget? Vivi could only shake her head because she'd forgotten too. Or maybe forgotten wasn't the right word. She'd driven the memory of this connection, this heat, from her mind along with all the rest of Rhys. She hadn't let herself remember how good it was between them because that would mean the summer fling she had at 19 somehow trumped every other relationship in her adult life, and that was too depressing to contemplate. Or maybe you were scared, a little voice in her mind reminded her, because if he was the best you lost him too soon. His hands were skating over her hips now, gathering up the material of her skirt, and even as Vivi told herself she'd be completely out of her mind to have sex with her ex in a freaking library, she wasn't stopping him. In fact, she was helping him, her own hands going to shove his jacket off his broad shoulders even as she situated herself more firmly on the edge of the table. Rhys was standing between her legs and she could feel him, hard and hot through the denim of his jeans, pushing against the cradle of her thighs as they just kept on kissing, and Vivi put one hand on the table behind her so that she could brace herself to press even closer. The sound he made as she rolled her hips against him sent electricity racing down her spine, and Vivi tilted her head to give him better access to her neck, her eyes drifting shut as her fingers clutched the edge of his jacket. Then he was kissing her mouth again, his tongue stroking hers, his hips moving against her in a way that made her feel more than a little crazy. Vivian, he murmured against her neck, his hand stroking her thigh, and she nodded, needy and wanting. Touch me, she heard herself say. Rhys, please. She was wearing tights, but she could still feel the press of his fingers along the seam there between her legs, and she tilted up into his touch, gasping. Okay, so that part of the curse definitely didn't work, she muttered, and Rhys lifted his head, gaze foggy with desire. What? Nothing, she said, shaking her head. Just do it again. He did, and Vivi lowered her forehead to his shoulder, her grip on his shirt so tight she was surprised the fabric didn't tear. This was insane, irresponsible, stupid, and she was going to do it anyway. When Vivi heard the first scream, The first thought her dazed, lust-addled mind could come up with was that someone had walked in on them. But no, as the scream came again, it was clear that it wasn't that close. Rhys had frozen too, his head slightly tilted toward the door. I'm guessing that's not a normal sound in the library. Still only half aware of what was going on, Vivi shook her head, blinking. No, that's... The third scream was followed by a low rumble, and Vivi leapt to her feet, smoothing her skirt down back over her legs with one hand as Rhys took her other, pulling her toward the door. Come on. As they came out of the study room, Dr. Fulk had already stepped down from her massive desk and was looking off through the stacks back toward the regular part of the library, her wrinkled face creased even further with worry. Something's wrong, she said, shaking her head, and Vivi had the sense Dr. Fulk wasn't even talking to them. And then Rhys was pulling her back through the shelves in the direction they'd come this morning, closer and closer to that awful screaming. The strange thing was, the closer they got to the source of the sound, the more Vivi's heart pounded, not just with fear but with that same overwhelming sense of magic she'd felt earlier, that cold sense of wrongness that had seeped in from the moment they'd entered the library. She and Rhys burst out of the stacks, and the cold nearly sucked Vivi's breath from her lungs. Earlier it had been chilly. Now it was frigid, so cold it almost hurt, and she looked around her with wide eyes. Students were cowered under study desks, huddled in corners, and in the center of the room. Is that? Rhys asked, and Vivi could only nod, dumbfounded. It's a ghost. Rhys stared at the apparition in front of them, wondering how someone who grew up where he had never seen a ghost before. Truth be told, he hadn't actually believed the damn things were real, because if they were, there'd be no better place for them than Penhaven Manor. This seemed very real. The woman was a glowing greenish blue, her eyes wide in her pale face, feet dangling just a bit off the floor. But the weirdest thing about her was how she was dressed. She had on jeans, a flannel shirt over a t-shirt, and a pair of Converse high tops with sharpadoodles on the toes, her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail as she glared at them. Whenever she'd died, it hadn't been all that long ago, and Rhys found that more unsettling than he could explain. The kid nearest him, a tall skinny guy in a Penhaven College hoodie and jeans, was sitting on the floor, his hands raised over his head like he was warding off a blow. What the hell is that thing? He asked Rhys, and Rhys fought the urge to reply, how in the name of sweet fuck would I know? Vivi stepped a little closer to the apparition. What's she looking for? She asked. The ghost was still moving back and forth, her head swinging from side to side, and yes, she definitely seemed to be searching the shelves for something, her pale face contorted into a scowl. And then she seemed to see him. Son of a bitch, Rhys muttered under his breath. I think she's looking at... Vivian started, but before she could finish the sentence, there was a banshee shriek, and the ghost was flying at him. For a moment, the cold Rhys had felt earlier seemed to slip over him from head to toe, enveloping him as though he'd fallen into the sea. And then he was flying. Well, not flying so much as tumbling slightly above the floor, his back connecting painfully with a bookshelf. Dimly, he heard it creak and wobble, heard the shrieks of the students in the library, the pounding of running feet and Vivian calling his name. But above all of that, he could still hear that shrill scream the ghost had uttered, like Satan's teakettle whistle, and as he tried to sit up, he winced, holding his ribs. None seemed broken, but they were definitely sore, and if that thing decided to take another shot at him. The ghost had its back to him now, its attention focused on the shelves in front of it, and as Rhys watched, spectral fingers reached out to take a book down, only for the ghost to howl in frustration as her hand passed right through whatever it was she was trying to hold. Still she tried again and again, her movements jerkier and more frantic, and Rhys swallowed hard as he attempted to come to his feet. Vivian was still standing there, frowning at the thing, and when she took a hesitant step even closer, Rhys lifted his hand. Vivian, he called, and the ghost's head whipped around, eyes narrowing. He could feel it gathering up energy, the temperature in the room dropping even further, so cold now that he could see his breath, and every hair on his body seemed to be standing on end. Bracing himself for another attack, Rhys gritted his teeth. But then the ghost stopped, floating slightly to the right to glare at Vivian, who still stood there, studying it like it was a puzzle she couldn't quite work out. With a sound somewhere between a sigh and a wail, the ghost dropped her head, and as suddenly as a soap bubble popping was gone. The room almost immediately became warmer, and Rhys looked around him. The few students in the room had fled, leaving him and Vivian alone among the overturned tables, the abandoned textbooks and pages of notebook paper that had fallen to the floor, the library suddenly very quiet after all that chaos. Rhys moved over to Vivian, taking both her hands in his. They were freezing, and he chafed her fingers between his palms. Are you all right? He asked in a low voice. Moments ago they'd been kissing. More than kissing, really. Rhys knew when a kiss was just a kiss and when it was a prelude to more, and what they'd been doing in that study room had definitely been leading somewhere. He could still taste her on his tongue, still feel the damp heat he'd touched between her legs. But now she was pulling her hands out of his and moving back, her eyes a little distant. Fine, she said. You. Rhys gingerly touched his ribs again. Nothing a hot bath and a nice whiskey won't fix. She nodded, then looked back to the shelf the ghost had been searching. What was she looking for? That's what you're concerned about? Rhys asked, raising his eyebrows. Not the fact that ghosts are real? That part too, she said, walking over to the shelf, frowning as she scanned the titles there. Have you ever seen one before? Most definitely not, Rhys said, shoving his hands in his pockets with a shudder. He could still feel the unnatural coldness of the spirit slipping over him, remembered how he'd felt suddenly not in control of his own body. Fucking horrifying. And it hadn't just been the cold he'd felt, that thing had been angry at him. But why? Miss Jones. A woman stood in the doorway between the regular library and special collections, Dr. Fulk hovering nervously behind her. She could have been anywhere between 50 and 80, somehow ageless and ancient all at once, her hair a bright shock of white against her dark skin, and she was wearing, as far as Rhys could tell, about 68 scarves. Next to him, Vivi heaved a deep sigh. Dr. Arbuthnot, she said, and then looked at Rhys. Head of witchery.